I'm Jamie Heineman.
And I'm Adam Savage.
The myth we'll be investigating today is if there's evidence to support a smallpox genocide on behalf of the U.S. government. Smallpox is a viral infection spread by close contact. What happens to your body is you get pustules filled with the virus all over you. When they pop, they can spread the disease very easily. Many people in Europe died from smallpox outbreaks, but over time they built up resistance and immunity to the disease. Because of this built-up immunity, not as many people died when the disease broke out in Europe. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, they were at a disadvantage when exposed to the smallpox because they had no resistance or antibodies against it built up in their systems. Viruses such as smallpox were responsible for the death of about 90% of the Native American population. The population continued to decline from smallpox for over 100 years after their first exposure. Native Americans believed that disease was a curse or a type of religious punishment for bad things. They didn't realize it came from the Europeans. They tried herbal remedies, but this often dehydrated the victims and caused a quicker death. They did sacred dances and rituals to also try and stop the spread, but that didn't work. Eventually, they started to avoid villages that were already infected. The Native Americans didn't quarantine their sick for a very long time because they viewed it as abandoning loved ones. In fact, when their loved ones were sick, they would stay very close to them, and this just increased the spread of the disease. Eventually, they switched to a quarantine, though, to stop the spread. The Native Americans lost many elders, and this caused a lot of their culture to disappear as well. Many of the natives lost friends, families, and tribal members, and this resulted in a really high suicide rate as well, either from the grief or because they didn't want to die from the disease themselves. Many groups of natives combined after losing so many members, and this decreased cultural diversity from tribes combining into one. Many of the Europeans were okay with it when a lot of the natives started dying from the disease, though, because it made them feel superior. However, the Europeans did not initially infect the Native Americans with smallpox on purpose. There is evidence of blankets infected with the virus being given to the natives by a commander-in-chief of the British military. There is also some evidence that the U.S. Army did the same in 1837. These cases were both biological warfare because they were done on purpose. However, the Europeans did not initially infect the natives with smallpox on purpose. Most of the disease spread naturally. These two accounts are the only accounts of it being done on purpose, and although it did kill some natives, it did not kill most of the population that died from it. In 1801, Jefferson made it a point for the natives to get vaccinated. However, many of them did not because they thought it was a trap, rightfully so. The Europeans did do horrible things to the natives, and so did the United States government, such as forcing them onto reservations. The deaths caused by the Trail of Tears and violence, I think, should be charged as genocide, because those deaths were intentional, or at least indirect of carelessness and force. However, specifically the smallpox epidemic was a natural disaster, and I do not think the government should be held responsible for those deaths. Even though there is some evidence with the blankets, the majority of the native deaths from disease were natural, and because of their lack of exposure to these diseases previously. Therefore, this myth is busted, because the majority of the smallpox epidemic occurred naturally.
Our second myth has to do with whether a genetic shift caused the Native Americans to become more prone to alcoholism. The Europeans came over to the Americas and mingled with the indigenous people here in the 1400s. However, they brought over lots of stuff, including diseases. And the impact of these diseases was very, very large on these Native Americans. To test this theory that the Europeans could have possibly brought over diseases that altered the Native Americans' DNA forever, we got permission to study the remnants of people who lived in the area both 6,000 years ago and people who live there today. We found that by comparing the ancient DNA and modern DNA to each other, there was a genetic shift that happened around 175 years ago. Most people who died contained the genes that were more likely to be influenced by diseases in the immune system. This basically determined that when the Europeans came over, the European body and genes pretty much became dominant, while the Native American bodies and their genes were left to adapt to that, or to those conditions, after they had already adapted to the factors in their own environment. So this was very unfair. As for the alcoholism issue, before the Europeans traveled to the Old World, the Native Americans were not very aware of the effects of alcohol, as some alcohol was only used in ceremonies. As Europeans brought over large amounts of alcohol with them to the New World, Native Americans did not know how to control or regulate their use of so much alcohol. They wanted to fit in socially with what the Europeans were doing, as the Europeans used this alcohol in trade much of the time. This high level of alcohol consumption became a sort of tradition for later generations of Native Americans, and it has led to some modern-day alcohol-related health issues. During our testing, however, we did find 2 genes that have been found to protect against heavy drinking. However, while studying these bones, we did not find these gene mutations present within the Native Americans. Therefore, they lack these genes that protect them against alcoholism. By concluding that there was, in fact, a genetic shift that happened in the Native American culture around 175 years ago, as well as the lack of the gene mutation that allows Native Americans to be protected against alcoholism, this myth is confirmed.
Thanks for watching this episode of
Mythbusters.